Alex Wilson stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, watching the city lights flicker on as dusk settled over the skyline. 15 years ago, he'd been coding in a tiny apartment with nothing but a dream, and his dad's words of encouragement ringing in his ears. Now, as CEO of BrightPath Technologies, he employed over 200 people and had just closed a deal worth millions. His phone buzzed. A text from his father, Robert. "Don't forget dinner Sunday. Your mom's making that chicken you love." Alex smiled. No matter how successful he became, his parents never let him forget where he came from. Robert had worked as a janitor for 30 years, cleaning office buildings much like this one, while putting Alex and his sister through college. Hard work and respect, Robert always said. Doesn't matter if you're cleaning toilets or running the company, everyone deserves respect. That's why the conversation he'd overheard in the break room earlier that day bothered him so much. Two of his executives hadn't noticed him coming in as they complained about the new diversity hiring initiative. "Just another checkbox," one had muttered. The other had laughed and added something about lowering standards that made Alex's blood boil. He'd built BrightPath on principles of innovation and inclusion. As one of the few black CEOs in the tech industry, he'd faced plenty of closed doors and subtle discrimination on his way up. He'd promised himself his company would be different. But lately, he wasn't so sure. The company had grown so fast in the last 3 years. New hires, new departments, new management layers. Alex couldn't be everywhere at once, couldn't see everything. What happened when he wasn't around? Did the culture he'd worked so hard to build evaporate the moment he left the room? His assistant knocked lightly on the door. "Your 5 o'clock is here, Mr. Wilson." "Thanks, Lisa. Give me 2 minutes." Alex straightened his tie and took a deep breath. He'd address his concerns tomorrow. Tonight, he had to focus on the Johnson account. Still, the thought nagged at him like a loose thread on an expensive suit. Something wasn't right at BrightPath, and he needed to find out what. Sunday evening found Alex sitting at his parents' dining table, his mom's famous lemon chicken on his plate, and his worries spilling from his lips. Robert and Patricia Wilson had always been his sounding board, the people he trusted most in the world. "I just don't know what's really happening when I'm not there," Alex said, pushing peas around his plate. "The executives all smile to my face, talk about how committed they are to our values. But then I hear things, see little signs that make me wonder." "Can't you just ask people?" his mother suggested. Alex shook his head. People tell the boss what they think he wants to hear, especially when that boss controls their paycheck. Robert had been quiet listening. Now he set down his fork. "When I was working at Westfield Tower, the big boss came through once a year for inspection. Place would be spotless, everyone on their best behavior. But I saw how things really ran the other 364 days. "Exactly," Alex sighed. "I need someone on the inside who can see what happens when people think no one important is watching." Robert's eyes lit up suddenly. "What about me?" "What about you, Dad?" "I could go undercover. As a cleaner." Robert leaned forward, warming to his idea. "I've still got my old uniform. Chum from the cleaning service owes me a favor. He could add me to the night crew at your building for a couple weeks. Nobody would look twice at an old janitor." Alex stared at his father. "Dad, you're 67. You retired 5 years ago because your back was giving you trouble. My back is fine now. And I'm bored out of my mind with retirement. Your mother's sick of having me underfoot." Robert winked at Patricia, who rolled her eyes affectionately. "It's not a bad idea," Patricia said. "Nobody notices the cleaning staff. It's like they're invisible." "Exactly," Robert nodded. "People let their guard down around us. I'd see and hear everything. How your hotshot executives really treat people, what they say when you're not around." Alex considered it. His father had sharp eyes and sharper ears. People did tend to ignore cleaning staff, as if they were part of the furniture. And who better to trust with his company's future than the man who taught him everything about integrity? 2 weeks, Alex said finally. "And you report any back pain immediately." Robert grinned, looking suddenly years younger. "Deal. Now, who wants dessert?" "Your mother made apple pie." As they moved on to discussing his sister's new baby, Alex felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Soon, he'd know the truth about BrightPath, for better or worse. Robert stood in front of his bathroom mirror, studying his reflection with a critical eye. The man looking back at him was both familiar and strange. He'd let his beard grow out for the past week, something Patricia hated, and had swapped his contact lenses for the thick-rimmed glasses he'd worn years ago. The blue uniform shirt, pulled from the back of his closet, still fit, though a bit more snugly around the middle than it once had. "You sure about this?" Patricia appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, concern etched on her face. "Your back is just fine," Robert finished, turning to kiss her forehead. "Besides, I'm not demolishing a building. Just pushing a broom and keeping my eyes open." Patricia adjusted his collar. "Just remembered you were 67, not 37. And these corporate types can be nasty when they think no one's watching." Robert chuckled. "Don't I know it? Cleaned up after them for 3 decades. He patted his pocket where he tucked a small notebook. "That's why this'll work. They won't even see me." The plan had come together faster than expected. Robert's old friend Chang, who owned the cleaning company contracted by Brightpath, had been happy to add Robert to the night crew as a temporary worker. Alex had arranged for Robert to have access to all floors, including the executive level that was usually off-limits to cleaning staff. Just for 2 weeks, Alex had insisted, handing Robert a security badge with the name Bob Williams and a grainy photo. "And Dad, be careful. If anyone figures out who you are, it could get messy." Now, as Robert drove to Brightpath headquarters for his first night shift, nerves fluttered in his stomach. It had been 5 years since he'd worked, and he'd never been much for sneaking around. But the worry in his son's eyes had been real. Something was wrong at Brightpath, and Robert was determined to find out what. The cleaning crew gathered in the basement at 6 p.m., just as the last office workers were heading home. Chang introduced Robert as an old pro coming back to help out, which earned him respectful nods from the other cleaners. Most were immigrants or older folks like himself, invisible to the world of suits and ties above them. "10th floor is yours tonight," Chang told him, handing over a cart loaded with supplies. "Executive offices. They're picky up there, so be thorough." "Got it," Robert nodded, feeling his heart rate pick up. The executive floor, right into the lion's den on night 1. The elevator ride up was quiet, just him and his cart. When the doors opened, he found himself in a hallway of glass-walled offices, most dark now, with plushed carpeting and expensive artwork. His son's office was at the end, the biggest one with the corner view, but Robert steered clear of it. Instead, he started methodically working his way through the floor, emptying trash cans, wiping down surfaces, and vacuuming, just as he had thousands of times before. The floor wasn't completely empty. A few executives were working late, their offices pools of light in the darkened space. Robert kept his head down, the brim of his cap shading his face, just another invisible worker in their peripheral vision. He was cleaning the conference room when he overheard his first conversation. 2 voices drifted from the partially open door of the office across the hall. "Wilson's new diversity initiative is going to be a nightmare to implement," a male voice said. "HR's breathing down my neck about hiring quotas now." "Just hire whoever he wants, then find a reason to let them go after probation," a woman replied with a laugh. "Works every time." Robert's hand tightened on his trash bag. He recognized the woman's voice, Vicky Henderson, the head of operations who always smiled so warmly at Alex during meetings. "You think he knows how we really run things when he's not looking?" the man asked. "Please. He's too busy being the poster boy for black excellence. As long as the numbers look good and everyone smiles at his town halls, he's happy." Robert struggled to keep his face neutral as he quietly moved his cart past the office. The contempt in their voices made his blood boil. This was his son they were talking about, his boy who'd worked twice as hard as everyone else to get where he was. By the end of his first shift, Robert's back ached, but his notebook was filled with observations. Names, comments, behaviors, little things most people wouldn't notice, but that painted a disturbing picture. As he drove home in the early morning darkness, he wondered how much worse it would get, and how heartbroken his son would be when he found out the truth. By his 3rd night at Brightpath, Robert had settled into a routine. He'd arrive at 6 p.m., collect his cleaning cart from the basement, and make his rounds through the executive floor, keeping his eyes down and his ears open. The other cleaners had accepted him without question, just another older man trying to make ends meet. Tonight, he'd been assigned to clean the 5th floor where the marketing and sales teams worked. The floor was buzzing with activity despite the late hour. The team was preparing for a major product launch, and stress hung in the air like a fog. Robert quietly emptied trash bins and wiped down surfaces, blending into the background as people rushed around him. No one gave him a second glance. It was a skill he perfected over 30 years of cleaning, becoming part of the furniture, invisible yet ever-present. Near the break room, he overheard two young sales reps talking in hushed tones. "Did you see how Tom spoke to Ling in the meeting today?" one whispered. "I thought she was going to cry." "That's nothing," the other replied. "You should see how he treats the support staff when the higher-ups aren't around. Called my assistant sweetheart and told her to fetch him coffee like she was his personal maid." Robert made a mental note. Tom Clark, the VP of sales who Alex had recently promoted. The same man who'd praised Alex's leadership style at the company picnic last summer. As Robert moved down the hallway, he noticed a conference room with the door slightly ajar. Inside, a heated discussion was taking place. He positioned his cart near the door and began methodically cleaning the nearby water fountain, straining to hear. "Wilson's diversity push is cutting into our bottom line," a man's voice growled. Tom Clark, Robert realized. "We're hiring people based on how they look instead of whether they can do the job." "Keep your voice down," another man warned. "Walls have ears." "Who's going to hear?" "The cleaning guy." Tom laughed. Robert hunched his shoulders further, making himself smaller, less noticeable. "Look, I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. Wilson's turning this place into a charity case because he feels guilty about making it." "The board likes the positive press," a woman countered. "All those articles about Brightpath being progressive and inclusive, it's good for the stock price." "Sure, but we're the ones dealing with the fallout," Tom replied. "These diversity hires need extra training, extra time. And they're so sensitive about everything." Robert's hand tightened around his cleaning cloth. He wanted to walk into that room and tell them exactly who these diversity hires were, talented people like his son, who'd had to work twice as hard to get half as far. But he stayed put, reminding himself why he was here. Later that night, while cleaning the executive bathrooms, Robert overheard Vicky Henderson on a phone call in her office. She'd left her door open a crack, probably thinking the floor was empty. "He's so naive," she was saying, her voice dripping with condescension. "Always talking about company culture and team building. Meanwhile, we're the ones making the tough calls that keep this place profitable." Robert glanced through the crack in the door. Vicky was leaning back in her chair, feet up on her desk. "Of course I smile and nod when he talks about his precious diversity initiative," she continued. "What choice do I have? But between us, I've been slow-walking the implementation, finding little ways to delay, you know." Robert pulled out his phone and hit record, careful to keep it hidden in his pocket. Alex would need evidence, not just his father's word. By the end of his shift, Robert's back was aching, but his resolve had hardened. The disrespect was worse than he'd imagined, and more calculated. These weren't just thoughtless comments. This was systematic undermining of his son's vision for the company. As he drove home in the pre-dawn light, Robert debated whether to tell Alex what he'd discovered so far. His son had worked so hard to build this company, had such faith in the people he'd chosen to help him run it. Learning that they mocked him behind his back, actively worked against his initiatives, it would crush him. But the alternative was letting these vipers continue to poison everything Alex had built. Robert decided to gather more evidence before coming forward. He needed to understand how deep the problem went and exactly who was involved. What he didn't realize was that the worst was yet to come. A week into his undercover mission, Robert felt the weight of what he'd discovered pressing down on him like a physical burden. Each night revealed new layers of disrespect and undermining that left him struggling to maintain his disguise. Twice now, he'd almost snapped at executives who'd spoken about his son with thinly veiled contempt. Tonight, he was back on the executive floor. Most offices were dark, but light spilled from the conference room, where a late meeting was wrapping up. Robert kept his head down as executives filed out, nodding politely when one of them held the door for him. Only when they dispersed did he enter to clean. The trash cans overflowed with coffee cups and sandwich wrappers. Someone had spilled coffee on the polished table and left it to dry. Robert sighed and set to work, his muscles protesting after a week of manual labor. As he wiped down the whiteboard, He noticed notes from the meeting still scrawled across it. Q4 restructuring, the heading read. Below were bullet points. Cut diversity budget by 30%, reassign D&I staff, delay inclusion training until next FY. And in the corner, someone had written Wilson doesn't need to know details. Robert quickly took a photo with his phone. This was the clearest evidence yet of deliberate sabotage. He was so focused on documenting the whiteboard that he didn't hear the footsteps approaching until it was too late. What are you doing? Robert spun around to find Tom Clark standing in the doorway, eyes narrowed suspiciously. Just cleaning up, sir, Robert mumbled, quickly pocketing his phone. Tom stepped closer. Were you taking pictures of company information? No, sir. Just checking messages from my wife. Robert busied himself with emptying the trash. Tom watched him for a long moment. You know, you look familiar. Have we met before? Robert's heart hammered in his chest. Don't think so, sir. I just started last week. Tom didn't look convinced, but his phone rang, distracting him. We'll continue this later, he said before stepping out to take the call. Robert finished quickly and moved on, but the encounter left him rattled. He needed to be more careful. Later that night, while cleaning Vicky Henderson's office, he found a printed email in her trash bin. The subject line caught his eye. R.E. Handling the Wilson problem. He smoothed out the crumpled paper and began to read. The email was a response from Tom to Vicky. We need to be strategic about this, it read. The board loves Wilson's public image, but they care more about profits. If we can show his initiatives are hurting the bottom line, they'll side with us. Meanwhile, keep gathering dirt on his precious diversity hires. Any mistake they make, document it. We'll build a case that his hiring practices are lowering standards. Robert's hands shook as he folded the email and slipped it into his pocket. This wasn't just office politics, this was a coordinated effort to undermine his son and everything he stood for. As he moved through the quiet building, Robert reflected on what he'd learned. The problem wasn't just a few bad apples or casual prejudice. The senior team his son had trusted, people who smiled to his face and praised his leadership, were actively working to sabotage him. What hurt most was how they talked about Alex. Not as a capable CEO who'd built a successful company, but as a token black executive who'd gotten lucky. They dismissed his accomplishments and mocked his commitment to diversity. To them, his race defined him more than his achievements ever could. Robert found himself in the hallway outside his son's office. The door was unlocked. Cleaners had access to all rooms, and he slipped inside, needing a moment to collect himself. Alex's office was neat and organized, with family photos on the desk. Robert picked up a frame containing a picture of himself, Patricia, and Alex at his college graduation. His son had worked so hard, overcome so much, and now these people were trying to tear him down. Robert set the photo down carefully and made a decision. He planned to complete the full 2 weeks, but what he'd found tonight changed things. This wasn't just disrespect, it was a coordinated attack. Alex needed to know immediately. As he left the building at the end of his shift, the weight of what he had to do made his steps heavy. Telling his son the truth would hurt him deeply. But letting these people continue their sabotage would hurt him more. Tomorrow, Robert would bring everything into the light. Robert didn't sleep well that night. He tossed and turned beside Patricia, his mind replaying everything he'd seen and heard over the past week. By morning, dark circles shadowed his eyes, but his resolve had hardened like concrete. You're telling him today? Patricia asked, setting a mug of coffee in front of him. The kitchen was bright with morning sunlight, a stark contrast to his mood. Robert nodded, spreading out the evidence he'd collected on the table, his notebook full of observations, photos of the whiteboard, the crumpled email from the trash. Can't wait any longer. Things are worse than we thought. He'd texted Alex earlier. Need to meet. Important. Your office, 9 a.m., his son had replied with a simple oak, probably assuming it was about the undercover operation. Robert arrived at Brightpath still wearing his cleaner's uniform. It felt strange entering through the front door in daylight, nodding to the security guard who'd seen him empty trash bins just hours before. The guard did a double take, but let him through when Robert showed his badge. The morning bustle was in full swing. People hurried through the lobby clutching coffee cups, focused on their phones, barely glancing at the older man in the blue uniform. Robert took the elevator to the top floor, feeling oddly exposed. Alex was on a phone call when Robert knocked on his office door. He waved his father in, eyes widening at the sight of the uniform, then quickly wrapped up his conversation. "Dad, what's going on? Why are you wearing?" "We need to talk," Robert said, closing the door firmly behind him. "Now." For the next 20 minutes, Robert laid out everything he'd discovered. The dismissive comments about Alex's leadership, the systematic undermining of the diversity initiative, the plans to gather dirt on new hires, the whiteboard notes about cutting programs without Alex's knowledge. As he talked, he watched his son's expression change from confusion to disbelief to something harder, a cold anger that reminded Robert of Patricia when someone threatened her family. "I knew something was off," Alex said finally, his voice tight. "But this," he picked up the email, read it again, then set it down carefully, as if it might burn his fingers. "Tom and Vicky, my two top executives." "Not just them," Robert said gently. "The CFO was in on it too. And probably others." Alex stood up abruptly and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. For a long moment he said nothing, just stared out at the city skyline. When he turned back, his eyes were wounded but his jaw was set. "I trusted them," he said simply. "Brought them in when the company was still small. Promoted them. Defended them to the board." He shook his head. "And all this time—" "I'm sorry, son." "Don't be." Alex straightened his shoulders. "You did exactly what I asked. Now I know what I'm dealing with." Before Robert could respond, the door swung open. Vicky Henderson walked in, then stopped short at the sight of Robert in his cleaner's uniform. "Alex, we need tow." She broke off, looking between them. "Is everything okay? Should I come back later?" "Actually, your timing is perfect," Alex said, his voice eerily calm. "Have a seat, Vicky." Her eyes flicked to Robert again. "Is the cleaning staff joining our meeting?" "This is my father," Alex said. "He's been working undercover as part of the cleaning crew for the past week." "At my request." The color drained from Vicky's face so quickly that Robert thought she might faint. "Your father?" "Yes. And he's been learning some very interesting things about how this company runs when I'm not around." Alex picked up the email and held it out to her. "Care to explain this?" Vicky's eyes darted to the paper, then to the door, as if calculating whether she could make a run for it. Instead, she sank slowly into a chair, her carefully constructed facade crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide. "Alex, it's not what you think." "I think it's exactly what I think." Alex cut her off. "And we're just getting started." By noon, Alex's office had become the eye of a storm. News had spread through the executive floor that something big was happening. People whispered in corners, casting nervous glances toward the closed door. Inside, Alex sat behind his desk, Robert standing beside him like a sentinel. Across from them, Vicky twisted her hands in her lap, her earlier confidence shattered. "I want names," Alex said, his voice level but cold. "Everyone involved in this." Vicky swallowed hard. "It wasn't personal, Alex. Just business. The board has been pushing for higher profits and—" "Don't." Alex held up a hand. "Don't try to justify this. You deliberately undermined my leadership and the company's values. You worked to sabotage people's careers because of who they are, not what they could do." He tapped the stack of evidence Robert had collected. "And you did it all behind my back while smiling to my face." The intercom on Alex's desk buzzed. "Mr. Wilson, the board members are assembled in the main conference room as requested." "Thank you, Lisa." Alex stood, straightening his tie. "Dad, would you mind staying in your uniform for this next part?" Robert raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" "Absolutely." A grim smile touched Alex's lips. "I want them to see exactly how I found out what's been happening here." Vicky paled further. "The board?" "Alex, please, can't we discuss this privately? I'm sure we can work something out." "Like you were working things out with Tom." Alex's eyes flashed. "I don't think so." The walk to the conference room felt like a funeral procession. Vicky trailing behind them, Robert still in his cleaner's uniform, Alex carrying the folder of evidence. Employees stopped and stared as they passed. Many looked confused, some worried, a few with dawning understanding. The conference room fell silent as they entered. 8 board members sat around the polished table, along with Tom Clark and 3 other executives. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to outright alarm, especially when they saw Robert in his uniform. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Alex began, standing at the head of the table. "I've called this emergency meeting because I've discovered something disturbing about how BrightPath is being run when I'm not looking." He introduced Robert, explaining the undercover operation. With each word, Tom Clark's face grew redder, while the other executives looked increasingly uncomfortable. "For the past week, my father has been gathering evidence of systematic undermining of company policies, particularly our diversity and inclusion initiatives. He's documented multiple instances of disrespect, insubordination, and outright sabotage." Alex handed copies of the evidence to each board member. "You'll find documented proof that several senior executives have been working together to cut diversity programs without board approval, block the advancement of qualified employees from underrepresented groups, and create a hostile work environment." The oldest board member, Mrs. Chen, put on her reading glasses and began examining the documents. Her expression darkened as she read. "That's not all," Alex continued. "They've also been keeping separate books on certain projects, misrepresenting results to make my initiatives look like failures while taking credit for successes." Tom Clark shot to his feet. "This is ridiculous. You can't possibly believe the word of a janitor over your executive team." "Sit down, Tom," Alex said quietly. "That janitor is my father, who worked honestly for 30 years cleaning offices just like this one. And yes, I believe him over executives who've been lying to me." Mrs. Chen looked up from the papers. "If these allegations are true, this is extremely serious." "They're true," Robert spoke for the first time. "I heard and saw everything myself, recorded some of it too." He met Tom's furious gaze steadily. "When people think you're nobody, they don't watch what they say around you." The board chair cleared his throat. "I think we need to discuss this in detail. Mr. Wilson, the elder Mr. Wilson, would you mind walking us through exactly what you found?" As Robert began speaking, Alex watched the faces around the table. Some showed shock, others embarrassment. A few looked unsurprised, as if they'd suspected something like this all along. By the time Robert finished, there was no doubt left in the room. The evidence was overwhelming. The board chair looked at Alex. "What do you recommend we do?" Alex stood at the head of the conference table, looking at each face turned toward him. The room had fallen silent after the board chair's question. Even the usual sounds of the office beyond the door seemed muted, as if the whole building was holding its breath. "What do I recommend?" Alex repeated, his voice firm and clear. "I recommend immediate termination of everyone directly involved in this sabotage." Tom leaped to his feet again. "You can't do that. The company would fall apart without us." Alex didn't even look at him. BrightPath was built on innovation, respect, and integrity. Anyone who doesn't share those values doesn't belong here, no matter their position. The board chair nodded slowly. "I believe we need to vote on this." He looked around the table. "All in favor of terminating the executives implicated in this evidence?" One by one, hands went up. Some quickly, others with reluctance, but in the end, the vote was unanimous. Even the board members who had been closest to Tom and Vicky couldn't ignore the weight of evidence before them. Effective immediately, the chair announced, turning to the implicated executives, "You will be escorted to your offices to collect personal belongings, then out of the building. Company devices and access cards will be surrendered now." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Security guards appeared to escort the fired executives. HR representatives rushed to process paperwork. The news spread through the building like wildfire. 7 senior executives terminated at once, including the CFO and VP of Sales. By late afternoon, Alex found himself back in his office with his father, both men exhausted but relieved. "You did the right thing," Robert said, finally removing the cleaner's cap he'd worn all day. "Wasn't easy, but it was right." Alex nodded, staring out the window at the city below. "I keep thinking about all the people they hurt. The careers they blocked, the talent they drove away." He turned to his father. "How did I miss it for so long?" "Because you trusted them," Robert said simply. "That's not a weakness, son. Trust is necessary, but so is verification." He smiled slightly. "That's why you sent in your old man to be your eyes and ears." A knock at the door interrupted them. Lisa, Alex's assistant, poked her head in. Sorry to disturb you, but there's something you should see. She led them to the main floor, where employees had gathered in small groups, talking excitedly. The mood wasn't fearful as Alex had expected, but almost celebratory. A young woman from the design team approached him. Mr. Wilson, we just wanted to say thank you. Things have been difficult with certain executives. She glanced at her colleagues, who nodded encouragingly. We've been afraid to speak up, but many of us were considering leaving. Today feels like a fresh start. Others joined in, sharing stories of being overlooked, discounted, or mistreated by the fired executives. Alex listened, stunned by how much had been happening right under his nose. Later that evening, as the office emptied, Alex walked the floors with his father, seeing the building through new eyes. We had a lot of rebuilding to do, he sighed. You've got a good foundation, Robert replied. And now you know what was broken. The next morning, Alex called a company-wide meeting. Standing before his employees, still wearing his father's blue work shirt over his own dress pants, he spoke from the heart. Yesterday, we removed people who didn't share our values. Today, we begin to rebuild. He looked around the room, meeting eyes of different colors, faces of different shapes. I'm creating a new open-door policy. Anyone, at any level, can bring concerns directly to me. He patted the blue shirt. And once a month, I'll be working alongside our maintenance and support staff to remind myself that every job here matters. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. My father taught me that respect isn't something you earn with a title. It's something you show to everyone, every day. Alex smiled at Robert, who stood at the back of the room, eyes shining with pride. He cleaned offices for 30 years with more dignity than some people show in corner offices, and he just saved this company by doing what he's always done, working hard and telling the truth. As applause filled the room, father and son exchanged a look that said more than words ever could. The company would heal. The culture would strengthen. And two men who had seen both sides of the corporate ladder would make sure that everyone at BrightPath was truly seen and heard.